You won't believe what happened the night my neighbor's son stayed beside me in the dining room. Even now, when I think about it, I still get that strange mix of warmth and disbelief running through me. Before I tell you everything, let me know down in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? I always love seeing people from all over, especially those cozy small towns and quiet suburbs where the crickets still sing at night. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe, not just to keep up with my stories, but because sometimes life reminds us that we're never too old for surprises. Now, let me tell you how it all began. It was late autumn, that soft in-between time when the trees look tired, like they've given all they can. My name's Margaret, and I've lived in the same neighborhood for nearly 30 years, the kind of place where everyone waves from their porches, even if they don't remember your last name. My husband, John, passed away 5 years ago, and since then the house had started to feel much bigger than it used to. I kept it tidy, of course. That's what you do when you've got no one else around. You keep things neat, as if that could make up for the silence. Across the street lived the Taylors, nice folks. Their son, Ethan, had grown up right in front of me. I used to bake him cookies when he was a boy. He'd always been polite, the kind of kid who said, "Yes, ma'am," without being told to. He went off to college, then work, and I didn't see much of him for a few years, until one night when he came back home. It was a Saturday evening, and the rain had been steady all day. I remember standing by the window, watching the gray water streak down the glass. I'd made a small roast for dinner, just for myself. Old habits die hard. Then right as I sat down, I saw headlights pull up across the street. It was Ethan. He looked older, taller, more filled out, not the lanky teenager I remembered. I waved through the window, not expecting him to notice, but he did. A minute later, there was a knock on my door. "Hi, Mrs. Clark," he said, water dripping from his hair. "Mom and Dad went to visit my aunt, but I didn't want to stay in an empty house. I saw your lights on." I told him to come in. Of course I did. I couldn't just let him stand out there in the rain. I found him a towel, and before I knew it, we were sitting in the dining room together, the roast between us, the storm whispering against the windows. It's funny how comfortable it can feel when someone familiar walks into your life again, like they'd never really left. We started talking, at first about ordinary things, the weather, his job, how much the neighborhood had changed. But soon the conversation deepened, as if both of us were hungry for something more than food. He told me about his work in the city, how it was busy and loud, and how he missed the quiet. I told him about my garden, how the tomatoes had done well that summer, and how the evenings had started to feel longer lately. Every now and then, I'd catch him watching me with a kind of softness that surprised me. Not the look of a child toward an old neighbor, but something else, something I couldn't quite name at the time. The light in the room was golden, the kind that makes everything look a little more forgiving. I remember the smell of rain mixing with the roast, the faint hum of the old refrigerator, the way the candle flickered just enough to make the shadows move. Ethan leaned back in his chair, smiling, telling me about how he used to sneak into my yard as a boy to steal apples from the tree. I laughed and told him I'd always known. Then came a pause, the kind that sits heavy between two people. He looked down, tracing his finger along the edge of his plate, and said quietly, "You know, I always liked being here." It felt safe. I felt something shift in me then. Maybe it was the way he said it, or maybe it was just the sound of the rain outside, steady and sure. For a moment, I wasn't the 60-year-old widow sitting across from her neighbor's son. I was just a woman, one who remembered what it felt like to be seen. We talked for hours, the way people do when time doesn't seem to matter. He told me things about his parents, about his fears of failing, of feeling like he was living someone else's idea of success. I listened, and in turn, I shared more than I expected to. About John, about the years that had passed too quickly, about the quiet ache of getting older. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. At one point, I stood to clear the table, but he stopped me. "Let me help," he said, his hand brushing mine just lightly. It was nothing, a simple gesture, but I felt it, all the way down to my fingertips. The kind of touch that lingers, not because it's bold, but because it's real. We moved slowly around each other in the small space, collecting plates, rinsing dishes, trying them. It all felt so normal, yet strangely intimate. There's something about doing simple things together that brings people closer than words ever could. When the kitchen was clean, I poured us both tea. The rain had softened to a mist, and the night outside had gone quiet. I could see our reflections in the window, him sitting beside me, both of us leaning slightly forward, like two people who didn't want the moment to end. He told me he'd been feeling lost lately, unsure of where he belonged. I told him I understood, that belonging wasn't a place but a feeling. And maybe that night, sitting side by side in my dining room, we both found a small piece of it. It wasn't about romance, not really. It was about connection, two souls brushing against each other in the dim light, reminding each other that we still mattered, that we were still capable of warmth and laughter and quiet understanding. When he finally stood to leave, it was close to midnight. He thanked me, his voice soft. "I didn't realize how much I needed this," he said. "Me neither," I replied. He smiled, that same boyish grin I remembered, but with a man's weight behind it. Then he stepped out into the cool night, the streetlights casting long shadows as he crossed the road. I stood by the window, watching him disappear into the darkness, feeling something inside me, something that had been asleep for a long time, begin to stir again. That was the night my neighbor's son stayed beside me in the dining room. I didn't know it then, but it would change the way I looked at my life, and at myself, in ways I never expected. The next morning, the house felt different. The same creaks, the same ticking clock on the wall, yet there was a stillness that carried something new. I woke early before the sun, and found myself standing by the window again, staring across the street at the tailor's house. The curtains were drawn, the porch light still glowing faintly in the gray dawn. I wondered if Ethan was awake. I made my usual cup of coffee, black with a touch of honey, and sat at the dining table, the same one where we talked for hours the night before. His cup was still there, half forgotten on the edge, the faint trace of a smile on the rim. I don't know why I noticed that, but it made me feel something tender and strange. Maybe it was just that I hadn't had company in so long, at least not the kind that made me feel truly seen. The day passed quietly. I tried to busy myself with chores, laundry, sweeping the porch, tending to the plants. But my mind kept drifting back to that conversation, the way he'd looked at me when I spoke about John. There was no pity in his eyes, just patience. Understanding. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that kind of listening. By evening, I found myself checking the window more than I wanted to admit. The sky had gone soft and pink, and the air was cool enough to bring a sweater. I had just sat down to read when there came another knock at the door. When I opened it, there he was again. Ethan. Same calm smile, same uncertain warmth in his eyes. He held a small paper bag. "I brought you something," he said. "Mom made too much soup earlier. I thought you might like some." It was such a simple thing, and yet it filled the doorway with something gentle and kind. I told him to come in, and soon we were back at the dining table, the same seats as the night before. The steam from the soup rose between us, and for a moment it felt like déjà vu. The same rain starting to whisper against the windows, the same soft glow of the lamps. He asked if I'd slept well, and I laughed, telling him that I was too old to lose sleep over anything. But the truth was, I hadn't slept much at all. I'd been thinking about life, about how time doesn't stop even when our hearts wish it would. We ate in silence for a while, comfortable and easy. Then he leaned forward a little, resting his elbows on the table. "You know," he said, I don't think I've ever told anyone half the things I told you last night." His voice was soft, but the honesty in it felt like a hand reaching across the table. I told him that sometimes we don't need to explain ourselves to everyone, just to the ones who really listen. He smiled at that, and something in his shoulders eased, like he'd been carrying a weight for far too long. After dinner, he insisted on helping me clean up again. I tried to tell him not to bother, but he wouldn't hear it. So we worked side by side, the rhythm of it easy, familiar. The clink of dishes, the sound of running water, the gentle scrape of plates, all blending into something that felt almost like music. At one point I dropped a spoon, and when we both reached for it, our hands touched again. It wasn't planned, wasn't even noticed for a second, but the warmth of it lingered. Neither of us spoke, but our eyes met, and there was something in that moment that went deeper than words could go. When the kitchen was spotless, I poured us both tea again. He laughed, saying, "This is becoming our thing, isn't it?" "Seems that way," I said, smiling back. We carried our mugs to the living room this time. The lights were low, the clock ticking softly on the mantel. He sat in the armchair across from me, and we started talking about the kind of things that fill empty evenings, childhood memories, dreams that never came true, the odd comfort of nostalgia. He told me about the pressure he'd been under, expectations from work, from family, from himself. I told him how it feels to look back and realize how many chances you let pass by, how many words you never said. And somewhere in all that sharing, I realized how much alike we were, despite the years between us. Both of us trying to find meaning again, in a world that sometimes forgets to look closely. The rain grew heavier, drumming gently on the roof. The room felt cocooned, warm, the kind of safe that invites truth. "You make this house feel alive," he said quietly after a while. The words caught me off guard. I looked at him, unsure what to say. "It's just an old house," I finally replied. He shook his head. "No, it's you. The way you talk about it, the way you keep it, like every corner still matters." For a moment, neither of us moved. I felt a lump form in my throat, that familiar ache that comes when someone touches something tender inside you. I wanted to thank him, but the words didn't come out right, so I just smiled instead, and he seemed to understand. The clock struck 10 before I realized how late it had gotten. I offered to pack him some leftovers, but he refused. "I'll be fine," he said, standing slowly. "Besides, I think I've already gotten more than I came for." That made me laugh, though there was a hint of truth in it that neither of us ignored. He walked me to the door, and before leaving, he turned to me as if hesitating over something unsaid. "Would it be all right," he asked, "if I came by again? Maybe tomorrow?" I nodded, a quiet warmth spreading through me. "Of course. You know where to find me." When the door closed behind him, I leaned against it for a long time, listening to the rain. My heart felt both heavy and light, like something had been stirred awake inside me. It wasn't just companionship I felt. It was connection, a kind that reminded me of who I used to be before the years, and the losses and the quiet set in. That night, as I climbed into bed, the rain finally stopped. The air outside was still, the streets glistening in the moonlight. I looked toward the window once more, across to where Ethan's house stood in the dark. And I realized something simple. That life, no matter how many years have passed, still has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. Tomorrow, he would come again, and I wasn't afraid of what that might mean. The following day felt unusually bright, almost as if the world had decided to wake up with a little more color. The rain had washed everything clean. The sidewalks glistened, the trees looked alive again, and there was that fresh smell in the air that always reminded me of beginnings. I stood by the kitchen window, holding my cup of coffee, waiting without admitting to myself that I was waiting. By mid-morning, I told myself I wouldn't think about him anymore. I tried to keep busy, sorting old photographs, dusting the bookshelf, even baking an apple pie I didn't need. But the truth was, my mind was full of last night's conversation. The way his voice softened when he spoke about feeling lost, the quiet steadiness in his eyes when he listened to me. It had been years since I'd felt that kind of ease with anyone. When the doorbell finally rang in the afternoon, I didn't even pretend to be surprised. He stood there, that same boyish grin on his face, holding a basket of oranges. "Mom said these are from the tree out back," he said. "I thought you might like some." I laughed. "You really don't need a reason to come by, Ethan." He smiled, and I could see in that moment that he knew I meant it. We went inside, and soon we were in the kitchen together, peeling oranges and talking like old friends. The scent filled the room, sharp, sweet, alive. I handed him a slice, and when our fingers brushed again, I didn't pull away this time. Neither did he. We ended up sitting at the dining table, the afternoon sun spilling across the floor in golden patches. The air was soft, still carrying a little chill from the storm. He told me about a project he'd been struggling with at work, something about deadlines and pressure, and the feeling that no matter how hard he tried, it wasn't enough. I told him I understood that feeling all too well. Life has a way of making us feel small sometimes, even when we're doing our best. Then he said something I didn't expect. "You know, when I was a kid, I used to think you were the calmest person I'd ever met. You never raised your voice, never seemed rushed. It was like you had all the time in the world." I smiled, though it hurt a little. Maybe that's just what happens when you learn that time isn't really yours to keep. You start to hold it more gently. He nodded, looking down thoughtful. "I wish I could learn that." "You will," I said. "Maybe you already are." There was a silence then, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind that fills a room with warmth, where everything that doesn't need to be said is somehow already understood. Later, I made tea, chamomile this time, and we carried our cups into the living room. The light outside had turned honey-colored, streaming through the curtains in soft stripes. Ethan looked around, his eyes resting on the framed photos of John and me on the mantel. "You must have loved him very much," he said quietly. "I did," I replied, "in the kind of way that doesn't really end, even when it's over." He was quiet for a moment, then looked back at me. "And now?" The question hung there between us. I didn't know how to answer it. Love changes over time. It bends, softens, becomes something different, but still real. I took a sip of my tea before answering. Now I think I'm learning to love life again. Just differently. He smiled, a small, tender smile. That sounds like something I should be learning too. We talked until the sunlight faded into evening. The house felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. He helped me bring in firewood from the porch, laughing as he nearly dropped half of it. The sound of his laughter filled the house, and for a moment I imagined what it might have been like if things had been different, if I had met him in another time, another place, when the years between us didn't matter so much. But life isn't about what could have been. It's about what is, those small, honest moments that remind you you're still here. As the fire crackled in the hearth, we sat close, not touching but near enough to feel each other's presence. I could see the glow of the flames reflected in his eyes. "You know," he said softly, "I didn't plan on coming over that first night. I just saw your light on, and something told me I should." "Maybe some lights are meant to be seen," I said. He looked at me for a long moment, like he was trying to memorize something. Then he said, almost to himself, "I'm glad I did." It was quiet after that, just the sound of the fire and the steady rhythm of our breathing. I could feel the warmth of the moment settling around us, delicate and real. Not something to analyze or question, just something to feel. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated by the door. "Tomorrow," he said. Not a question this time, just a quiet promise. I nodded. Tomorrow. After he left, I walked back to the living room and stood by the fire, listening to the last crackles before it died down. The air still held the scent of oranges and tea, and I realized I was smiling. It wasn't just that he made me feel young again, it was that he made me feel alive, seen, heard. And as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I found myself whispering a thank you into the quiet, not to anyone in particular, but to life itself for sending warmth my way when I least expected it. Tomorrow he would come again. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to let the world surprise me one more time. The next morning began with sunlight streaming across the floorboards, thin and golden, cutting through the stillness like soft music. I don't know why, but I woke earlier than usual, as though some part of me was waiting before my mind even caught up. The air felt full of promise, the kind that comes before something quietly important. I dressed in a simple sweater, brushed my hair back, and took a moment by the mirror. 60 years behind me, a lifetime of moments, some joyful, some quiet, some heartbreaks that still knew how to echo if I let them. But that morning, my reflection didn't look tired. It looked awake. When Ethan arrived, he didn't knock right away. I heard him on the porch, his familiar shuffle, the hesitation before the doorbell rang. I opened it before he could press the button. He smiled, that easy, genuine smile that had become a kind of light in my days. "Morning, Mrs. Clark," he said, though there was a teasing lilt in his tone. I laughed. "You can drop the Mrs. Clark. You know, it makes me feel older than I am." "All right then," he said, grinning. "Good morning, Margaret." He was carrying a small basket again, this time with muffins. "I made these," he added, a little sheepishly. Don't ask how they turned out. We brought them into the dining room, the same place where all of this had begun. The table gleamed from the morning light, and the room smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood. I brewed coffee, and soon we were sitting together, steam curling up between us. The conversation was lighter that morning. Small things, ordinary things. The kind of talk that wraps itself around laughter. But beneath it all was something unspoken, something both of us could feel humming gently between the words. After breakfast, he asked if he could see the garden. It wasn't much, just a stretch of earth behind the house with a few stubborn flowers and fading autumn leaves, but it was mine. We walked slowly through it, the air crisp, our steps soft on the damp grass. "You've kept this beautiful," he said, crouching to touch a petal that had just begun to wither. "I suppose it's what keeps me busy," I said. "Things keep living here, even when I don't expect them to." He looked up at me, something thoughtful in his expression. "Maybe that's why I like being here. It feels alive." For a moment, neither of us moved. The wind rustled gently through the branches, scattering a few leaves around our feet. I could feel the sun on my face, the steady rhythm of my heart, and the quiet awareness of his nearness beside me. I turned to him and said softly, "You've brought a lot of light into this house, Ethan." He smiled, his eyes warm but serious. "You've given me something I didn't even know I was missing. Peace, a place that feels real." We stood there for a long time, two people from different parts of life's road, somehow meeting in the same moment of stillness. There was no need to say more. When we went back inside, the house felt warmer. He helped me move a few old books into the study, and we ended up sitting there, the afternoon light fading through the curtains. He told me about his plans, that he was thinking of leaving the city for a while, maybe moving closer, maybe starting something new. "You think that's foolish?" he asked. "No," I said. "I think it's brave." He looked at me for a long time, like he was memorizing every line of my face. "You've taught me more in these few days than anyone has in years." I laughed softly. "All I did was make dinner." "No," he said quietly. "You reminded me what matters." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, of gratitude, of understanding, of something that didn't need a name. I reached out and rested my hand on his for just a moment. It wasn't a gesture of longing or confusion. It was one of truth, of recognition, of something human and kind. As the sun began to set, we moved back to the dining room one last time. The golden light filled the space, touching the walls, the table, the photographs that lined the shelves. I poured us both one final cup of tea. He told me he'd be leaving soon, heading back to the city for a few weeks. I nodded, though a part of me ached at the thought. "I'll come back," he said, smiling softly. "You'll probably get tired of me before long." "I doubt that," I said. We laughed together, but there was a weight to the moment, not sadness exactly, just the quiet ache that comes when you know something meaningful has found its natural pause. When he stood to leave, he paused by the door, looking around the room one last time. "I'll see you soon, Margaret." I walked him to the porch, and as he stepped into the fading light, I said, "Take care of yourself, Ethan." He turned back, smiled, and said, "I will. Thanks to you." And then he was gone, walking down the familiar path, his figure slowly blending into the glow of the setting sun. I stayed there for a while, watching the street grow darker, the first stars appearing one by one. When I finally went back inside, the house was quiet again, but not lonely. Not anymore. I looked around the dining room, the soft light still spilling across the table where everything had begun. The air was filled with the scent of tea and muffins and something else, something like peace. I sat down and let the silence settle around me, not as emptiness, but as presence. For the first time in years, I felt whole. Sometimes the people who walk briefly through our lives leave footprints that never fade. They remind us that we are still capable of connection, of warmth, of beginning again. And as the last light of the day faded from the window, I whispered softly to myself, "Thank you." It wasn't just for him. It was for life, for the surprise of finding something beautiful when you'd long stopped looking for it, for knowing that even at 60, there are still new ways to feel alive.